All right. Well, again, welcome. And we're very fortunate to have Dr. Anthony LeBude on with us today, our nursery extension specialist. And I asked Anthony to do a presentation that I actually heard at Green and Growing last year and thought it would be an excellent topic for our Eastern North Carolina Nursery Conference that became the North Carolina Virtual Nursery Conference. And that topic is substrate amendments for large containers. So, Anthony, thank you so much for being with us today. And you can go ahead and share your screen and get started.
Uh, my pleasure, Danny. Thank you all for coming, and I do appreciate you having me because a lot of times at the Green and Growing show, the growers are moving in, and so many of them do not attend the meetings. And when I give the presentation at the at this nursery meeting, there seems to be at least close to 100 growers in the audience. Seems like that today. Also, I speak from experience of writing something in the chat and getting busted, so I do make sure you do watch out for that today. I am going to actually, you know what? I think I will share this one first. Um, so cooperative extension does have many resources, and we just introduced the Nursery Crop Science website that you can see at the top at nurserycrops.ces.ncsu.edu, and I broke it down into main themes for nursery productions. You can see on the left here: substrates, water, nutrition, IPM, management, propagation, and so forth. I'm just going to click on the substrates tab for today, just so you can see what's going on. And in it, it has bark as a primary substrate, just talking about pine bark and various studies that have been available, alternatives or amendments to bark, physical chemical properties, and managing your inventory. And each one of those has various articles. Now this is meant for learning about nursery production, going farther in depth into nursery production. It isn't meant that if you have your Tyvek suit on and you got your 100-gallon sprayer spraying and you want to figure out what the rate is for by Frenton or something. This isn't what this is for. This is for like planning something new, learning about the background information, what's been done research wise, and you get to take the time you'd like to spend as much time as you want to learning about it. So there are references posted here, and they are the actual PDF of the reference. So there are some things here from other universities, from other research publications, and these links aren't going to basically be corrupted because the PDF is actually there. Slightly illegal since we've posting things from other universities, but I don't have the time to be messing around with links back and forth if they break. So we're just gonna wait till someone sues me. So some of the papers that I'll be talking about today are on here. It's just a great way for you to learn is uh, in one setting without doing a bunch of Googling, research on substrates. There's also photos and all sorts of things that you can download and use yourself too, if you like. Let's see. All right, so we will get started. This is in collaboration with Dr. Jim Owen at who at the time was at Virginia Tech, but now he's with USDA, and Stacy Jones, who is the sort of middle of the state area specialized agent. So the work came about. Uh, a grower had contacted me because they had were growing plants in large containers, and the plants were starting to get um, uh, chlorosis of the foliage late in production, and we couldn't figure out why that was. So we visited, we did some pour throughs of the containers, and it turned out that there was lots of spots in the substrate that were completely dry and were very had high nutrient content. There was lots of available nutrients, but the roots weren't going in there because they were dry and had lots of nutrients, making them could burn the roots. And so we were trying to figure out how we could, what the problem was, what are the ways we could try improve water saturation throughout the whole profile of the container, and then also improve the overall size of the plant and quality. Just so you know, like plants growing in containers, I didn't realize that some ginkgo trees can be, up to 11 years in production, even in large containers. This was on an IPPS tour in Tennessee. I kind of took it personally since I'm in nursery production that, 11 years for something in the neighborhood of like 4 to 6 inch caliper. Um, I'm thinking like, this is what we're supposed to be doing better than this. But ginkgo is probably just a pretty slow growing tree. Also likes a lot of high pH. Um, Something more common here in North Carolina is 1 to 200 gallon containers using primarily pine bark grown in what they call phantom containers, where you have a wire basket lined with um, weed barrier and then some sort of staking system and then drip irrigation with different types of emitters delivering the irrigation. This is an alternative to ball and burlap, which, plants are much heavier. There's a certain window in which you can dig them. I mean, you can dig in the summertime, but uh, there's a certain window and a certain clientele that would be using B&B, where these large containers can be, shipped year round, planted year round, and are essentially lighter than B&B and allow you to grow large trees where the soil conditions may not be great for uh, ball and burlap. So the ball of the tree may not stay together because the soil doesn't have enough clay in it, perhaps. However, there are some problems with growing large containers above ground, um, that the volume itself of the container is finite. So the roots can penetrate everywhere in there, and then making it difficult to water, and then also girdling some of the roots around the container, depending on the length of time the plant spends in there. Um, Getting irrigation all the way to the entire top of the container can be a problem, depending on the volume of the pump that you're using, and then the stakes and the spray patterns. And then since it does spend a long period of time, anywhere from 1 to 2 years in production, even longer, that there's always going to be plugging of stakes and things falling out. Um, and then getting the actual water on top of the fertilizer to release it and have it come down through the profile of the container. And then over time in containers, uh, especially if you're using water that might have a high pH, it can tie up some of the micronutrients in the substrate, or the micronutrients can be used or leached out a little bit. And then after a year or so, if there are no micronutrients in the container, then you can get the sort of iron chlorosis that we see on the foliage in the left, which was one of the symptoms of the which drew us out to the nursery in the first place. Root growth to the side of the container, and it become girdling, and then that is sometimes a problem with trying to sell plants to municipalities that check to see if there are girdling roots or if the first lateral root is near the surface of the container. That can be combated in smaller containers that are plastic lined by using the copper coated containers that cause roots to branch out rather than circle around the container. But I'm not sure if that's used particularly in phantom containers. I'm not sure that's an option for the large sort of aerated containers. And then over time, since the plants have been sitting in that one position, you get substrate decomposition where the substrate that you're using, pine bark, is an organic amendment. It is going to break down and compost over time. So you start to get a distance between the top of the substrate and the top of the container. And generally, all containers have what they call a perched water table at the bottom, where there is a zone of 4 to 6 inches of sort of very moist water, or very moist substrate at the bottom, so that when the substrate decreases in the container, it brings the root system closer to that water, and then you can start to have problems with rotting of the roots, plants sitting in water more often, and then also uh, that those wet conditions, especially when it's hot in the summertime, can cause some of the feeder roots not be able to take up micronutrients. That then leads also to that yellow chlorotic situation that we saw earlier. So it's just a complex of those sorts of things. And it may stem from generally buying substrate from pine bark suppliers that is dry. And so these two containers on the left in the right of of course the same volume, and the same amount or same volume of bark was put in each container. And the one on the right, water was added, shaken up, and then drained out, and you can see the volume of the bark has decreased. And most tractor trailers deliver about 36,000 pounds of bark, where if it's dry, that's about 80 cubic yards. The truck looks really big, like it looks like you got lots of bark. But if the supplier wets that bark, the same volume of bark, wets it and put it in the truck, it doesn't look like you got a lot of bark. Plus, sometimes with it's wet like that, you can go over the capacity of the truck. And so growers tend to buy dry bark because it looks like they got more bark. But then they also may pot plants up with that dry bark and then try to irrigate it to wet it once it's in the container, and that can cause dry patches or preferential flow in the containers. So if you do purchase dry bark, you definitely have to wet it at the nursery, either before potting or at potting, but make sure that the irrigation, especially drip irrigation, has enough coverage to do that. So at the nursery, one of the options is always to irrigate with some sort of sprinkler over top of the bark, and it's sort of taboo to have any drainage going into the bark supply. Most bark supplies are supposed to be at the highest point in the nursery, so they don't have nursery drainage going into them. But if you do have the bark at the high point of the nursery, it's actually easier to keep it wet if you wet the bottom of it and let the capillary action of the bark itself wick up the moisture and then turn it. It's much easier to keep it wet that way in between potting. Just watering at the top for dry bark, it waters about the first half inch. You still have to turn it, but it sometimes can evaporate or not really penetrate the bark pile. You should just use the physics of the bark pile to your advantage because it will wick up the moisture. Then you turn it over, and then you got lots of moist bark particles inside the bark pile. So with not having bark in production that is as wetted and then turned over as much, you can get the dry patches, or bark can be pretty dry. And generally, bark is supposed to get to about 140, then you wet it and you turn it over, and then you wait till it gets there again, you sort of turn it over, and that ages the pine bark slightly, and then also allows the moisture to sort of be in the pile itself. But generally they're still probably turned. But if you get a bark supply in and you can't stick your arm inside the bark supply and keep it there for any length of time, that means the bark is probably too dry. It's getting too hot on the interior. But that is a very common practice. Also, you get these hydrophobic layers that occur just under the surface of the bark that don't allow water to penetrate below there. So if the bark pile is not turned, then it's very difficult to re-wet because of these hydrophobic layers. And they easily can get into containers and stay in these large containers and portions of the container. So that portion of the container, like say, 1/8 of it, looking at it as a pie, 1/8 of it, or maybe even just sometimes 1/4 of the whole container overall never gets wet during production. It just stays dry the whole time, and the plant has to deal with the other 3/4 of the volume in order to grow. And with that little bit of I guess adversity, the plants just don't grow as quickly as they would if they were growing in a 100% wetted container. So find suppliers that actually manage their piles, that do measure temperature. They turn it over. They might use moisture in production. They at least, measure physical properties of the substrates and allow that information for you to see it before you purchase. The more you know about your bark pile, of course, the better off your plants are going to be. Normally, you're going to want wetting in a container, especially a large container, you irrigate, it saturates every pore space in the container. And then after about 30 minutes, you have what they call container capacity with airspace in the pore spaces, and then some of the pore spaces uh, filled with water. When you have preferential flow, you get that wetting occurs, but the water only goes down sort of the easiest channels in the substrate, the ones that have been hydrated somehow when you first watered it or when it first came in, if there were some moist spots. And then where the dry spots are, the water just isn't going to go and wet that area. It's going to preferentially flow to the areas where there's least resistance or there's moisture already. And you'd be surprised. I mean, you've probably all seen pulling containers out, half of it's dry. It's a worse problem in large containers with drip irrigation. And bark generally has what they call a low hydration efficiency. Once it gets down to approximately 25% water in the bark, it's very difficult to re-wet it to container capacity again. You can add more water to it, but it just is difficult saturating it. You usually use amendments to do that, to help with that. And there are a bunch of amendments that you can add to substrates. We're just going to talk about a few today. But they are organic or inorganic. So organic, components have been alive at one time, like pine bark itself, peat moss, or some sort of compost, um, depending on where you get the source. Or inorganic, which is some sort of rock or sand or vermiculite, or we'll talk about today industrial clay. So usually the ones that are inorganic, that are rocks, they'll break down, but over a 300,000 year period, where organic materials, depending on how composted they are or how broken down they are, what material they're made of, sort of how much carbon to nitrogen ratio they have, that depicts how quickly they'll break down in production. So peat moss has a low carbon to nitrogen ratio, breaks down pretty easily. Pine bark is a little bit higher, takes a little bit longer time. And then wood substrates take an even longer time because there's lots of carbon and very low nitrogen. And so they take a little bit, but all of those organic substrates ultimately are going to be breaking down during production. So they each have chemical properties and physical properties. This is just a quick overview of the pH, cation exchange capacity, or its ability to hold on to nutrients, and then its electrical conductivity. Once you water it, what sort of available nutrients, or the amount of available nutrients that are available generally in that substrate without adding any fertilizer. So it's all, compared to soil, it's all pretty weak as a substrate. All these substrates are. Um, and sometimes depending on the supplier, it could come in with lots of electrical conductivity, meaning it's hot, or like there's lots of available nutrients, and it may not be the nutrients that you want. We'll talk about that in a second. But generally, they're all sort of start out in in the area that the pH that you need them to be, and you can amend them using fertilizer and lime. Some of the physical properties, that's really talking about just the size of the particles and then the amount of air that's in between the particles, and also their bulk density, or their dry weight of substrate per volume container. So you can see in the right here, you have the same volume. Let's say a quart size containers. This one's filled with cotton, the other one's filled with rocks. It's the same volume, but there's a different weight per volume, and that's all that bulk density measure. So you can compare substrates based on their bulk density. Then you have the total porosity, which is once you fill up this volume with your rocks or your cotton, there's airspace left that isn't a solid. And total porosity is that total airspace that's left over of the total volume of the container. So let's just say 500 mil container, and then you've got rocks in there. All the rest of the space, airspace that's in there that's left over, is the total porosity. And that's broken down into how much airspace you have and how much water you have after you water the plant to saturation. You fill every pore hole in that container and let it drain for 30 minutes. Then all that airspace, or the total porosity, is filled up with either air or water, and that's what you get. Normally, the best you get is when you first pot up. That's your best physical properties for that substrate, because over time these organic substrates will break down and those things start to decrease or change over time. This is just a visual depiction of the same thing. After watering, you have some air and you have some water in the spaces between the solids. So the best management practices by the Southern Nursery Association say total porosity should be anywhere between 50 to 85%, container capacity between 45 and 65, and air-filled porosity between 10 and 30. And you have the option of changing that around depending on what you're growing, where you're growing it, and what your substrates are. Now, there's lots of research on all sorts of substrates. Pine bark, adding all sorts of compost to them, using different type of wood substrates, different types of wood, different parts of the tree. But all of those substrates ultimately want these numbers as their starting block. They're trying to get in these numbers. So if you are thinking about trying a new substrate, or you are thinking about trying a new supplier, or as sometimes your brother-in-law has some free compost and is begging you to take it from him, um, you can mix it up in the substrate that you have already, but you really should send your substrate that you're about to pot up in to, say, Brian Jackson at NC State to get the physical properties tested. Or if you go to that nursery crop science site, on there is a way to test the air-filled porosity of that new substrate that doesn't require you to send a sample to Brian Jackson or pay $100. You can do it yourself, and it's pretty simple. And then you can say, well, am I 10%? And my brother-in-law is trying to suffocate all my plants because there's no airspace in there? Or am I closer to 30% that I'll give him one more chance to see if, I'm going to disown him from the family or not? That it might actually be this one time he hits on something and you've got a really good supply of compost to put in your substrate, and your overall substrate that you're using meets these numbers. If it isn't in these range, no amount of magic is going to make it better. Like, it has to be within these ranges. And then within those ranges, you have 100% of your volume here on the left, and then you got 15% is basically bark, and then the rest is 85% is the airspace in there. So just a different sort of depiction. And then about 30% of that's air, and about 50% of it's water. But within the water, you have available water, which is the water that the plant uses every day when you irrigate it. So it's got a lot in the morning if you water then, and then it uses it throughout the day, and then you water again. And there's also water that's just unavailable to the plant. But there's a little spot in between the 20 and the 30 there, where some substrates don't have a lot of available water. They hold onto it tightly. Some make that little bit of water more available to the plants more often. And so the plants have more water between waterings that's available to them to use. And we talk about chemical properties, physical properties, substrates, and everything else, but it's essentially just think about it as Gatorade, like with salts in it, which are your fertilizer. The more Gatorade the plant has to use while it's growing and it's available to it, the bigger it's normally going to be, as long as it's not sitting in muck. And all these substrates are just trying to keep the volume of Gatorade with fertilizer in it around the roots long enough that they can take up as much as they possibly want while they're growing without actually dying. So that is the sort of what we're looking to do. And so some of the substrates we used in this study were clays from Oil Dry, and it's been around forever. They got mines in Georgia and Florida, Arkansas, I think, maybe in Mississippi. And you might be, they make a lot of cat litter, which soaks up salts and moisture, also in shops for oil absorption and dust. So they're really good at holding um, for the amount of weight that they have, they can absorb a lot of moisture. So we use something called calcine clay, and it's calcined by using high temperatures. So it expands the clay to form a porous structure. It makes them more stable compared to just any old clay in the soil. You know how that sort of absorbs moisture, and then you got, muck, and then it dries out and it cracks away. This takes all that out of the way by expanding it and making it a stable structure. Now, they do this by using low temperatures or high temperatures. So the low volatile material is fired at high temperatures, and it is preferred for production in nurseries or generally in production. It's a little bit more expensive because they have to use higher temperatures to create the structure. And then you have regular volatile material, which is at lower temperatures. Now it can break apart and when saturated and feel a little bit more squishy like clay, but it doesn't go back to the same volatility that normal sort of soil clay would have. It can hold water internally without falling apart. It does reduce overall nutrient holding capacity to just the surfaces of the clay. So it isn't as good as clay in the soil. A clay soil has a great cation exchange capacity, but generally better than bark. So some of the benefits: it'll absorb phosphorus and keep it from leaching out of containers if that's an issue in the watershed that you're in. It does absorb lots of moisture. It does have a high cost of purchase, and it is pretty heavy in terms of its bulk density. So shipping it is a little bit more expensive than bark. And then shipping the containers themselves, once you have finished with the size of them and shipping them on trucks, is a little bit more expensive because they're heavier, but again, going to be less than ball and burlap. And there are some inconsistencies, and even if within a mine over time and between the mines. So you have a little bit of experimentation of thinking about adding clay into substrate production. Previously, though, Jim Owen, when he was at NC State, amended substrate with 8% of the low volatile, which you use the high temperatures. It decreased ammonium nitrate and phosphorus leaching by 40%, also daily irrigation by 15%, while producing the same size number 3 containers of cotoneaster. So what the saying is, by adding just a little bit of this clay to production, it's possible to use less fertilizer and less water and get the same plant. So if there are some issues with nutrient loss on the property or wanting to save save on nutrients, because if, say, for example, this holds more nutrients, doesn't let it leach out of the container, and holds more water, that's essentially increasing the volume of Gatorade around the roots. So then it keeps it there for a longer period of time and keeps the nutrients in the water available to the plant for a longer period of time. And so you can use less of each because they're more available for a longer period of time and get the same quality plant. Coconut coir is another amendment. The process generally takes the long fibers of the coconut and used for ropes. And then the pith and the short, medium fibers are left as a waste product. And then coir dust is created by finally screening that waste product, then drying into baling bricks for shipping. And usually shipped very dry and have to re-wet when you get them to the nursery. Comparing that to peat moss, sometimes it's been compared as an amendment to peat moss. pH is a little bit higher. EC is a lot higher, and it's usually potassium and sodium, because it is a coconut and likes to grow around salty environments. And I think one of the ways it probably lives in there is putting all that salt in the coconut rind that it takes up, and then taking that coconut and letting it float on the ocean and getting rid of the salt from the plant. So it allows it to take up the salt, but then compartmentalize it in something it's going to get rid of. Um, it has a high carbon nitrogen ratio, so it will last for a long time without degrading in production compared to peat moss. So peat moss over time can then compost and then no longer be in the container after a year, possibly sometimes. So depending on where the coir came from and the various places that I list them all over, yeah, so Costa Rica, Ivory Coast, India, Mexico. So it's produced all around the world. So finding a supplier that is consistent and then also allows publishes their physical and chemical properties of the supply that they give you is important. So depending on how they sort of break down the husks, called retting, if they soak them in fresh water or salt water to break them down before they sort of break them open, and or whether or not they use mechanical retting, breaking them open so they're not soaked in salt water first. And just like any pine bark supply, whether or not they're aged over time, that also affects their physical and chemical properties. So generally, coir improves airspace. Now in the South, I guess we call it coir. I think it's coconut coir. Coir. It's coir. Improves airspace while maintaining water holding capacity. So it not only does it hold moisture, it actually improves the airspace too, which is interesting because most substrates have to do one or the other. If you put in smaller particles that hold water, there's going to be less airspace, but it kind of does both at the same time, which is one of the beauties of it. But it also re-wets very easily. Like it's not hydrophobic like bark and peat moss is. It's hydrophilic, so it actually attracts water and makes the substrate easier to re-wet once it dries down in between irrigations. And it is lighter than bark, so it does lower the bulk density of the overall container, so the overall container will be a little bit lighter. And this is a study using coir in production with just pine bark, 35% coir, and then pine fines, just pine fines, which is less than the ½ inch. So it's everything that's sieved below ½ inch when you're using the bark. And then pine bark with 35% peat on the far right. Now, each of these plants had their own solenoid. So they each received the same sort of volume of water, but it was measured by, it would water it completely in the morning to container capacity. And then when it lost the same volume of water as everything, all the other treatments, it would then get rewatered. And so the time in which it took that to occur was the difference in the number of watering each plant got. And so the pine bark plus 35% coir is bigger than the others because the plant utilized that water more quickly than the other three treatments. So what they're saying is the Gatorade that we talked about was available over a longer period of time in the substrate before it became unavailable to the plant because of the coir added. So it got to drink Gatorade as often as it wanted to, and it got more water than the others because it used it very quickly compared to the other treatments. Now it didn't use it any better. So for example, 1 unit of water equals 1 unit of growth for all of these plants. This didn't use water like 1 unit of water and 2 units of growth. It didn't make it a magic plant. It still grew at some of the just same rate. It just received more water more often because it used every bit of its Gatorade. And then when it got watered, every bit of that Gatorade was available again. In the others, it wasn't that case. Some of it evaporated because the plant couldn't get to it because it was trapped in pores in the pine bark that were making it unavailable to the plant. The coir made it available to the plant by using being able to be re-wet and then moving the water laterally in the container to make it available to the roots rather than just leaving little pockets of dry areas everywhere. Okay, so let's get to the study that we did with big containers. And we've got plenty of time, so that's okay. We used pine bark, which was just sieved at a ½ inch, which is a very common size pine bark. And then we amended that with clay called Terra Green, which was sieved between 0.1 inches and 0.03 inches. So it's just whatever was in there to make it a consistent size. And we did it at 6% and 12%. So conveniently, if you put one of those bags in a cubic yard, you get 6%. Two, you get 12%. Now we had started removing the volume of substrate that matched the volume of the clay in order to mathematically make it work, but that's not happening in real life. So essentially, one bag of clay or 2 bags of clay in per cubic yard. And then coir, we did remove the equivalent volume of pine bark because coir itself has a pretty big volume because it's super fluffy once you wet it. So we put it in at 10, 20, and 30% of volume in the substrate. So the coir that we used had a low electrical conductivity, less than 1. So it means that they probably used fresh water when they were retting it and may not use much fertilizer in production. So that's good. It wasn't super high. pH was just great, and had also correct moisture content thing just for like the fact that it could be used and it wasn't too dry. It came in super dry, and we wetted it at first using a hose and a crowbar, and that was probably in hindsight one of the dumbest things we did, I think, because it took forever. So instead, we decided just to lay each brick in one of the containers we were using, or a 25-gallon container, and let a impact sprinkler water them overnight. And then when we came back the next day, they were all completely broken apart and wetted perfectly. They weren't saturated and they weren't dry. They were ready to be used in production. It was no more fused brick anymore. So that's the way to sort of do it. But they're available already slightly hydrated from various production suppliers now. So you can get the dry brick and do it yourself, or you can get an entire bag of it already fluffed. The clay, we added the clay, and you can see the little white particles on the right in the substrate. So those little teeny white particles will be the clay particles that we added. That's probably the 12% treatment. We just mix those up sort of on the substrate platform. All nutrient amendments were the same for all of the treatments, and they're all very common for nursery production in large containers. Used 2 maples and 2 oaks, so 4 different species. And the reason we used 4 different species that were sort of nothing like one another is because in nursery production, when you're going to make some sort of change or recommend using something different, it's great that it might, with one plant like a Cotoneaster, you get all this exorbitant growth, but there's 400 species of plants people grow, and so it needs to be able to show an improvement across a wide array of plants. Because I've noticed the growers, they may have 2 different substrates, not a different substrate for every species or like groups of species. They sometimes have a wet substrate and a dry substrate, and these plants get the wet one, these ones get the dry one, or the relatively speaking. So I wanted to do this over a number of different species to see if the difference would hold up. At the end of the study, we tried to measure working water holding capacity of the substrates. It's very difficult, because they're super heavy. So how we did this was we watered them with the normal amount of irrigation they would get during the day, the 15 to 18 gallons delivered like for 15 minutes twice. And we did it exactly how they did it, 15 minutes. They waited 30 minutes and they did it again 15 minutes. So we did that. And then we waited afterwards for it to drain out. And that would be considered their watering cycle per day, or their container capacity, every pore space saturated in the container. Then we waited and then weighed that. And then we turned the irrigation back on. and we used a hose from a truck, and we took the hose and we stuck it down in the substrate for another 15 minutes and tried to water get every patch in there that had been dry since potting or whatever as saturated as possible to see how much water the substrate could hold had it been watered to its optimum sort of saturation. And these are the physical properties of each one of the substrates after the 2 years in container. So this is what they are after they've gone through sitting in, 2 summers outside of Charlotte, above ground, getting watered, freezing, thawing, heating. The control was the pine bark, and you can see it's still airspace between 10 and 30. That's looking good. Container capacity 45 to 55, a little 45 to 60, and then total porosity usually is less than 85%. So it's still, the pine bark's still looking good after that period of time. But even that one, if we look at the far right, loss of potential water storage, the grower thought that they were irrigating as much as they possibly could each day, but it turns out there was 13% of that substrate that was not getting watered. And so that's basically, the bottom 2 fingers of the Gatorade bottle not getting to be drunk. Now, some people say there's lots of saliva in there. I actually went down this road one time. It turns out there's not. Somebody studied the bottom of various drinks, and turns out there's very little saliva in the bottom of the drink. Still not drinking after someone if there's any left like that, but just so you know, nothing in it. Okay. So, but they could have added 13% more moisture, and every day getting 13% more water available to one of these huge shade trees may shave off a month or 2 of production. It's quite possible on the back end, because the plants get bigger, slightly bigger every day because they have a little bit more water with the salts in it. Now, if we look at clay compared to the control, it increased, 6% increased the total porosity a little bit, so it gave it a little bit more airspace. But it took that and divided it up into more airspace, 6% clay, and less water holding capacity, which is interesting. And even more so with the 12%. So it increased airspace and lowered the water holding capacity. So it essentially made the substrates drier than the control, which it's supposed to take up more moisture, but you never know these things until you actually try it. And definitely the 12% could have been watered more, and the 6% clay is sort of just like the control. Now, if we look at the Quar, it's a little bit different. It improved the total porosity, total airspace. If you look in the total porosity section, was a lot more than the other substrates, and it chose to improve the airspace slightly in the 10 and 20% range over the control, not much, but definitely a lot more water holding capacity in the 10 and the 20% range compared to 30%. And that's exactly what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to hold more water and improve airspace. That's its tail of the tape. And then, that's what I do. That's what I do. And it did it. It improved the airspace slightly compared to the control and improved the water holding capacity. But it was not getting watered up to its fullest potential. So it could have had more water added to it during the each day. Now everything was getting watered based on the control and how the grower had been doing it, since they started growing large trees. So if we look at this is all the species caliper increment. So they all started out somewhere like I think they were 7 gallons. I think they were like a 1/4 inch or 1/2 inch or something. They're all different, but this is the amount that they grew over the 2 years based on their the percent amendment added. So caliper growth over 2 years on the left side here, and then so it's not their final caliper; it's just the amount that it grew, and then the percent of the base. So looking at the clay, here's the control. So it grew about 1 inch and about 1 point. It grew about 1 inch total over that time frame. And then if you look at the clay, 6% grew a little bit less than that, and then 12% about the same, but maybe slightly more. But you can see like they had less water. The clay had less water in it, so of course it's going to be just like the control or less. Interesting. When you add the 10 and 20% coir, you have a little bit more growth, and the 20% had the highest, and it's essentially about 1/4 of an inch in caliper in the 20% coir groups across all 4 species. So it grew an extra 1/4 inch of caliper because every day it drank the last 2 fingers of Gatorade in the bottle because it's not afraid that it knew probably that there's no saliva in the bottom of that bottle. So feel free to drink all you want, all that rest. And each time it got irrigated, more water got into saturated more of the substrate where the roots were. So it did exactly what it was supposed to do. But is 1/4 of an inch of growth over 2 years, is that important? That's not, statistically it is. It's going to get published. But biologically, is it? That's something that the growers would possibly have to decide themselves. So just looking at envelope economics, just looking at Griffin greenhouses, they sell 13-foot bale of fluff coir for $40. They'll ship it directly to Oldcastle, which is just one pine bark supplier. If they add that to 2 cubic yards of pine bark, that automatically gets a 20% incorporated treatment. If it's mixed dry, then add some Aquatrol, which is about $10 to the 2 cubic yards. So for 13 trees, for those 30-gallon containers we used, for 2 cubic yards, it's about $3 per tree. So is 1/4 of an inch of caliper worth $3 per tree? That's, I don't know. The grower since has decided that they are going to put another organic amendment in the substrate, and they didn't use coir. They used something that another sales representative told them was cheaper that did the same thing. I don't know what it is. I don't know if that's the case. I don't know if that's somebody's brother-in-law. You know what I'm talking about? That's what I'm saying. Like, I did the work on coconut coir, 20% from that supplier. Other things could change the physical and chemical properties and not get the same result. So anyway, but in research, we look at the Cadillac and everybody wants to get the Pinto and try to get the same quality, which I understand. We all do that. It's just that, is that Pinto going to give you the same ride as the Cadillac? That's the question. The longer wheelbase in the Cadillac is a smoother ride. Okay. You're probably asking yourself the question, could I use some of the wood substrates that I hear Brian Jackson talking about? And he's done a tremendous amount of work on them and got all sorts of good quality and consistency out of them, and has published a lot of work on that. I did find one study that used wood substrates in large 25-gallon containers with red maples, DD Blanchard magnolia, and red oak. And they use 100% pine bark. I'm guessing a 1/2 inch, they didn't say. And then whole 1/4 inch sieved whole tree substrate, which is at thinning and forestry at around, I don't know, 6 to 8 years or 12 years after planting the plantation, they go in there and thin out trees to make more room for the trees that are remaining. And those trees are small and they grind up the entire tree. And then that is the whole tree substrate. 80% wood, 15% bark, 5% needles, or clean chip residual, which is perhaps the same trees or a tree that is getting ready to be milled. The bark and all of the limbs are stripped off, so you just have the main butt log. So, but all of that trash that comes off of it has branches in it, needles, cones, and bark. All of that's ground up and used as a substrate. I think that's how I remember working. It has less wood in it, more bark, and more needles. And over 500 days, growing in 25-gallon containers with drip irrigation, there was no difference in caliper um, among the treatments. This is just for summer red, but this was the only difference, was this quarter-inch whole tree compared to pine bark. Slight difference. That's, again, 0.2 inches, which is what we saw in my study. Statistically, it's significant. Biologically, don't know. But it did, no matter what they did, it didn't seem to matter. It didn't affect the plants. They grew just as well as pine bark did after 500 days. So using wood substrates, you might be able to get the same effect adding them into pine bark as you might do coir. But of course, we'd want to test that first. And lastly, looking at predictors of mortalities of trees planted in the landscape afterwards, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. And we talk about it being substrate or ball and burlap, and there's a lot of like foresters and urban foresters and talking about ball and burlap plants are planted too deeply, and that causes them to die later. And then substrate, huge trees with substrates dry out quicker because the substrate doesn't have enough bulk density. And so I found some studies that looked at what predicts the death of trees that are professionally planted. And there did it in Sacramento and Massachusetts, and it turned out that that generally flowering trees, it's a predictor of mortality. So these things tell you who's going to die first. So flowering trees die more quickly than shade trees and more quickly than conifers. And more recently built homes that have trees around them is a good predictor for death, or any plants that are planted near construction. The number of renters in the property, as it goes up, tree death also goes up. So I guess it really comes down to, who's watering it. Yeah, I watered it last week. It's your turn to water it. You didn't pay their rent. Okay. And also the number of trees planted. So the more trees that are planted, the more likely they are to die. So shade trees, one or two shade trees planted in a home that only has one or two renters in it, that's not near construction, is going to be the most likely to live over time. I doubt you're going to screen your customers for where they're planting them, depending on where the property is. But just an idea, it isn't us. Like saying this isn't great data to say that. Of course, I'm biased, but it isn't so much ball and burlap compared to substrates or whatever. It's really where it's getting planted and who's going to water it afterwards. Okay. So in summary, coir may improve your water holding capacity and re-wetting of dry substrates. We showed that. Also, the re-wetting nature of coir might actually help with being transplanted to the landscape because it barely gets any water. I mean, have you ever seen one of those gator bags on a landscape site that has any water in it? Like why would you buy them to put them on there if you're not going to fill them up? So this might help with the infrequent waterings that they get, being able to saturate the substrate a little bit better. But first of all, before you do any of that, is it possible to get a better pumping system for the irrigation that you're delivering to the plants, or get better irrigation stakes to get more water into the container itself, or really wetting the substrate thoroughly, or at least hydrating a little bit before it gets into the container, that then you have good irrigation on there? Like, those things might be more important to spend money on than buying a substrate amendment and sticking it in your pine bark. So, and adjusting the irrigation accordingly. So, we always have to get your ducks in a row before you do something else. Either way, though, you add 20% coir into production, you may get improved growth. All right, some of the folks that helped us out: North Carolina Nursery and Landscape Association, USDA provided some of the funding, as well as the cooperators supplying the coir and the clay. Of course, the Cooperative Extension Service, we are very fortunate to have in North Carolina. Thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Anthony. If anybody has any questions for Anthony, you can type those in the chat, or you can unmute yourself and ask your question. And while we're waiting, I'll just remind you that, in case you forgot, that there are no pesticide credits for today, so there will be no Google form shared for today. I will be sending some emails later today with some of the handouts from BWI and from Anthony. I discovered yesterday that there were some participants that could not receive when I sent them all together. So I had to go back and split those up. So I'm going to split them up today. So you may get 2 or 3 emails from me today following this with individual attachments and or links to things. And it looks like there's a few questions coming in, but before that, I did direct message a few people and ask them for their names. So just for our attendance, regular attendance purposes, Randy, I wanted to make sure I had the right Randy because we had 2, and then the other one was Galaxy Note 20 Ultra 5. If you could message me back and let me know, chat back and let me know who you are for just for regular attendance purposes. And so I don't see any questions. A number of thanks to you, Anthony, for the presentation and for the great information. And I know we've already got some participants logging off. I'll just mention that tomorrow's presentation is on Rose Rosette by Dr. Mark Wyndham from University of Tennessee. And there is a pesticide credit for that presentation. So this is your last opportunity for any questions if anybody has them in the chat, or unmute yourself.
Thanks so much, Danny. It's T.
You're welcome, T, and thank you for your support. All right. Doesn't look like there's any questions. Did I miss anything, Stacy or Amanda?
No, I think you're good.
All right. Well, thank everybody for attending, and appreciate it, and look forward to seeing you if you join us tomorrow. Everybody have a great day.
See you all later.